The 21st of September, 1938. Picture this. A Wednesday afternoon along the Atlantic coast. The air is warm, impossibly warm for late September. In West Hampton Beach, Long Island, children are walking home from school, their shoes kicking through the first fallen leaves of autumn. In Providence, Rhode Island, businessmen are loosening their ties, commenting on the unusual humidity. Along the Connecticut shoreline, summer residents are savoring one last golden afternoon before closing their cottages for the season. The sky is hazy, yes, but nothing alarming. The barometer is falling, but barometers fall all the time. And somewhere in the Atlantic, racing northward at a speed that defies meteorological logic, a monster is coming. The Weather Bureau has issued no warnings. The word hurricane has not been mentioned in any forecast. Within 6 hours, 700 people will be dead. This is the story of the Great New England Hurricane of 1938, the most powerful and destructive storm to strike the northeastern United States in recorded history. A storm that killed nearly 700 people across Long Island and New England. A storm that destroyed over 57,000 homes and damaged another 100,000. A storm that toppled 2 billion trees and caused damage equivalent to $6 billion today. But more than statistics, this is the story of a catastrophic failure of human systems, of communities erased in minutes, and of a landscape that would never look the same again. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten chapters of American history, consider subscribing to Archive Echoes, where we bring the past back to vivid life. To understand what was lost, you first need to understand what existed before. Along the south shore of Long Island, communities like West Hampton Beach, Quogue, and the Hamptons were summer playgrounds for the wealthy. Grand oceanfront estates lined the dunes, their wraparound porches facing the Atlantic. In Rhode Island, beach communities dotted the coastline from Westerly to Narragansett. Families had summered in these same cottages for generations, passing down the keys like heirlooms. In Providence, the state capital, downtown bustled with commerce. Department stores displayed their fall fashions. The industrial heart of New England hummed with textile mills and jewelry factories. Further north, Connecticut's factory towns produced everything from brass fittings to typewriters. And in Massachusetts, apple orchards heavy with fruit stretched across hillsides, while the fishing fleets of New Bedford prepared for the autumn catch. These were communities built on routine, on the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today. Now, you need to understand why no one saw it coming. In 1938, hurricane forecasting was primitive by any modern standard. There were no weather satellites, no radar systems, no computer models. Forecasters relied on ship reports, scattered weather stations, and educated guesswork. The prevailing belief among meteorologists was simple. Hurricanes did not strike New England. They curved out to sea, they always had. When a young forecaster named Charles Pierce at the Washington Weather Bureau noticed the storm's trajectory and suggested it might make landfall in the Northeast, his superiors dismissed him. Hurricanes simply did not behave that way. Besides, a high-pressure system should deflect it. They were wrong, catastrophically wrong. The first signs appeared around noon. The ocean began to behave strangely. Waves that normally rolled gently onto shore started arriving in confused, choppy patterns. The tide, which should have been going out, was coming in. Fishermen noticed birds flying inland in massive flocks. Dogs refused to go outside. Horses in their stables grew agitated. But these were subtle warnings, easily dismissed. At 2 in the afternoon, families were making decisions that would determine whether they lived or died. Some chose to drive to higher ground. Others decided to stay and watch the interesting weather. A mother in West Hampton put her children in the car to visit a friend inland. She lived. Her neighbor, who stayed to secure the shutters, did not. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the hurricane made landfall on Long Island. But this was no ordinary landfall. The storm was traveling at nearly 70 miles per HR, an almost unprecedented forward speed. This meant the winds on the eastern side of the eye wall were not just the hurricane's sustained winds, but those winds plus the storm's forward motion. The result was gusts exceeding 180 miles per HR. The atmospheric pressure dropped so rapidly that witnesses reported their ears popping violently. And then came the surge. A wall of water, 30 to 50 feet high, swept across the barrier beaches of Long Island. It did not rise gradually. It arrived all at once, like a dam breaking. The first to die were those closest to the shore. In West Hampton Beach, an entire community simply ceased to exist in minutes. 153 houses stood on the barrier beach that morning. When the surge receded, only 26 remained, and most of those were damaged beyond repair. Families who had retreated to their second floors found the water rising past the windows. Those who climbed onto roofs watched their homes disintegrate beneath them. A movie theater in West Hampton was showing an afternoon matinee when the surge hit. The building collapsed. 20 people drowned in their seats. Their bodies would be found scattered across miles of debris. The destruction spread with terrifying speed. On Long Island, entire communities were simply erased from the map. The barrier beaches at Fire Island were cut through in 6 places, creating new inlets where solid land had existed that morning. In Rhode Island, the surge funneled into Narragansett Bay, amplifying as it narrowed. When it reached downtown Providence, the water was 13 feet deep. Office workers on the first floors of buildings drowned at their desks. The downtown district, the commercial heart of the state, was submerged. In New London, Connecticut, a fire broke out in the flooded waterfront district. Firefighters could not reach it. The flames spread through the wreckage while the floodwaters still covered the streets. The city burned and drowned simultaneously. The infrastructure of modern life collapsed completely. Every telephone line between New York and Boston was severed. Every railroad track was blocked by debris or washouts. Every major road was impassable. The region was cut off from the outside world as completely as if it had been transported to another century. Radio stations went silent as their transmitters toppled. Newspapers could not print because their presses were flooded. For 3 days, communities existed in complete isolation, not knowing if help was coming, not knowing if anyone even knew they needed help. The mayor of Providence had to send a messenger by boat to reach the governor. The governor had to send a ham radio operator to reach Washington. But in the darkness of that terrible night, something remarkable happened. Neighbors who had lost everything began helping neighbors who had lost even more. In Westerly, Rhode Island, a man whose house had survived waded through chest-deep water for hours, pulling survivors from floating debris. In Connecticut, farmers hitched their horses to wagons and drove through the night to reach isolated communities. In Massachusetts, factory workers formed human chains to rescue people trapped in flooded buildings. Doctors performed surgery by candlelight. Teachers turned schools into shelters. Ministers opened their churches to anyone who needed refuge, regardless of faith. The formal systems had failed, but the informal bonds of community held. The rescue efforts that followed pushed human capability to its absolute limits. The National Guard mobilized within hours, but guardsmen found themselves facing obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Roads were blocked not by fallen trees, but by entire forests lying across them. Bridges had not just been damaged, but had vanished entirely. The Army Corps of Engineers brought in heavy equipment, but even bulldozers struggled against the mountains of debris. In some areas, the only way to reach survivors was by boat, threading through a landscape that had become an inland sea. Coast Guard crews worked around the clock, but the scope of destruction meant that some communities would not see rescuers for days. And in those communities, people waited on rooftops, on floating debris, in the upper floors of buildings surrounded by water, not knowing if anyone was coming. The story that would haunt New England for generations happened in Jamestown, Rhode Island. A school bus carrying 8 children was making its afternoon rounds when the surge hit. The driver, Norman Caswell, tried to outrun the rising water. He could not. The bus stalled on Mackerel Cove. As water poured through the windows, Caswell made a decision. He would carry the children to safety, one by one. He lifted the first child, a 7-year-old named Clayton Chellis, onto his shoulders and waded through the surge toward higher ground. He made it. He went back for the next child, and the next. 7 times, he fought through the churning water. 7 children he carried to safety. But when he went back for the 8th, the bus was gone. Joseph Madows, age 8, had been swept away. They found his body days later. Caswell never forgave himself for the one he could not save. The wind damage across interior New England defied comprehension. This was not a matter of branches down or shingles missing. This was wholesale destruction of the landscape itself. In Connecticut and Massachusetts, the hurricane flattened forests that had stood for centuries. Trees did not just fall, they exploded. The combination of saturated soil from weeks of rain and winds exceeding 100 miles per HR meant that root systems simply released. Entire hillsides of timber went down in minutes. The sound, survivors said, was like continuous artillery fire. The Connecticut River Valley lost 80% of its mature trees. Apple orchards that had been tended by the same families for generations were reduced to splinters. The lumber industry estimated that 2 billion board feet of timber was destroyed, enough to build 200,000 houses. The forest that New Englanders had known their entire lives was gone. When the winds finally died and the waters receded, the survivors emerged to a landscape they did not recognize. In coastal communities, foundations marked where houses had stood. Personal belongings were scattered for miles. A woman in Rhode Island found her wedding china in a field, 3 miles from where her home had been. A man in Connecticut found his car wrapped around a tree a quarter-mile away. The economic devastation was staggering, particularly for a region still struggling through the Great Depression. Fishing fleets were destroyed. Factories were flooded. Farms were ruined. And for most victims, there was no insurance. Homeowner policies in 1938 did not cover hurricane damage. Wind damage, yes. Water damage, no. And when the adjuster ruled that your house had been destroyed by surge rather than wind, you received nothing. The Great Hurricane of 1938 transformed American meteorology forever. The catastrophic failure to warn the public forced a complete rethinking of how weather prediction worked. Within months, the Weather Bureau began establishing a network of aircraft reconnaissance flights to track hurricanes. The concept of the hurricane hunter was born from the ashes of this disaster. New observation stations were built along the Atlantic coast. Communication protocols were overhauled to ensure warnings could not be blocked by bureaucratic skepticism. The hurricane warning system that protects millions of Americans today exists because of what happened on that September afternoon. Every time you see a hurricane track on the evening news, every time you receive an evacuation order days in advance, you are benefiting from lessons paid for in blood. The survivors carried the storm with them for the rest of their lives. Children who had watched their homes wash away grew into adults who checked the barometer obsessively. Families who had lost members never celebrated September the same way again. The physical landscape recovered slowly. The forests regrew, though it took decades. The beaches reformed, though in different configurations. The communities rebuilt, though some chose to relocate to higher ground. But the psychological landscape was permanently altered. A generation of New Englanders learned that the world could change completely in an afternoon. They passed this knowledge to their children, who passed it to theirs. Even today, in families throughout the region, the storm of '38 is spoken of with a reverence usually reserved for wars. 70 years of growth have softened the scars. The forests of New England are thick again, though an expert eye can still spot the even-age stands that mark where the old growth fell. The beaches have been rebuilt, protected now by seawalls and dune restoration projects. The Weather Service tracks every tropical system with satellites and aircraft and computer models. We have learned so much, but perhaps the most important lesson is the simplest one. On that September afternoon, what saved lives was not technology or government or infrastructure. It was people. Neighbors helping neighbors. Strangers risking their lives for strangers. A bus driver going back into the water again and again. The hurricane revealed how fragile our systems are, but it also revealed how strong our bonds can be. In Providence, there is a marker showing how high the water rose in 1938, 13 feet above the street. People walk past it every day without noticing. But for those who remember, for those whose families remember, that marker is sacred ground. It says, here we were tested and here we survived. If your family has stories from the Great Hurricane, I would be honored if you shared them in the comments. These memories deserve to be preserved. Until next time, this has been Archive Echoes.